All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time, and I really appreciate your interest in this topic. For me, it's definitely a very intriguing and dynamic topic from a professional standpoint because things are changing every hour, not even every day, in this area. But from a professional standpoint, from a personal standpoint, it is a very emotional topic for me because I am originally from Ukraine. I grew up in Ukraine. My grandparents farmed, so I worked on a wheat farm, and we grew also some potatoes. My family, my parents, my sister, her family are still there. A lot of my friends who stayed after we graduated from the university, they stayed there and they work in agriculture, in ag business field there. So it's definitely very close to my heart and very heavy, but thank you for joining. I really appreciate your interest. So today I thought I will share with you a couple of things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about agriculture industry in Ukraine in general, where we are right now and how we got there, kind of how we evolved as an agricultural country. We'll talk a little bit about key destinations for Ukraine's agricultural exports and also how that impacts the global food security right now. And then we'll talk a little bit about current situation on the ground, as I thought some of you may be interested to know what your Ukrainian counterparts are doing. So in general, if you look at Ukraine, oops, I apologize. In general, if you look at Ukraine, Ukraine is about the size of Texas, right? But agriculture is very important to our economy. About 40% of Ukraine's GDP comes from exports, and about 10% of GDP comes particularly from agricultural exports. And so that's why agriculture is so crucial to the economy of Ukraine, but also to food security around the globe, and we'll look at it why. So I'm going to talk about three focus today on three top kind of agricultural commodities, and that's sunflower, seed and oil, corn, and wheat. So if you look at the sunflower and sunflower seed and oil production globally, about Ukraine produces about 30, almost 33% of that overall production. And Ukraine accounts for about half of the world exports. So half of all the sunflower seed and oil in the world comes from Ukraine, making it the first largest exporter. When it comes to corn, Ukraine is definitely a much smaller player in the global corn market when it comes to production. We produce about only 3% of the world production of corn. However, when it comes to exports, Ukraine still remains the fourth largest exporter. So we account about for about 14.5% of world overall exports in corn. And we'll talk in a little bit about it, but Ukraine has significantly increased its corn exports in the last 10 to 15 years. And then finally, wheat. If we look at wheat production, I apologize. If we look at wheat market, Ukraine again is a smaller producer because other large producers of wheat such as China, India, Russia, just because of the size of their production. So Ukraine produces only about almost 4% of the total wheat production. However, when it comes to exports, we account for about almost 10% of overall global exports, and so that makes us the fifth largest exporter. So all that being said, small but mighty, right? Small country, but a pretty relevant country in the global grain market. So I wanted to share with you kind of the evolution of what happened in Ukraine over the last 23 years. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, we had a lot of instability, but if you look at over the last, from between 1994 and 2020, in terms of production of these commodities, what we see is that the wheat wheat production has increased slightly, but then kind of leveled off. Sunflower seed production has been on the rise. And what we see is significant increase in corn production, particularly after 2010. And so we'll talk a little bit about why we've seen such an increase, such a drastic increase in production of those commodities over the last 15 years. So kind of what were the drivers of that ag boom in Ukraine? Well, first of all, Ukraine has a lot of arable land. We have about for the size of the country. We have about 57% of total land that's arable. That accounts for about 81 million acres. And if you look at this map right here, this map particularly shows you the production of corn in the country, but overall, so sunflower and wheat production will have slightly different pattern, but or acreage across the country. But in general, a lot of agricultural production happens in the central part of the country and the eastern part. Then the next kind of intensive area would be northern part of the country, and then the next one would be western and southern. So the least production is in the west, but the most production is focused to north, central, and east. So we have a lot of acres. We have a lot of 30% of world's black soil stocks. So again, a lot of them, that's what attracts a lot of foreign investors because of a low cost strategy, right? Very fertile soils, you can save up on fertilizer and other inputs. We have suitable infrastructure. And so what do I mean by that? Ukraine is actually about 80% of all the freight in Ukraine is being transported through the rail network. We have a very extensive and well-developed rail network that, if you look at the length overall across the country, it's about 20,000 kilometers of the train track. And so that allows us to move a lot of grain through using the rail network, but also ports. So far, we have access to ports in the southern part of Ukraine. So you can see Port of Odessa and Port of Mykolaiv, and that's probably those are the two names that you have been hearing recently on news a lot. The ports, we move about 95% of grain through those ports down to North Africa and Middle East. So that remains a key area for us, for Ukrainians in particular, because of the importance of this infrastructure to agriculture. And then strategic location. So if you look, and I didn't show here on the map, but again, if you think about the location of Ukraine, we are blessed with location in terms of that we are very close. We have the sea in the southern part of Ukraine, right? Have access to the sea. And we are also in close proximity, relatively close proximity to the North Africa, Middle East. So again, it makes transportation easier, faster. So then post-Soviet era, what happened is we developed a lot of, as countries opened up, markets opened up, we developed favorable trade relationships and joined WTO. That opened up a lot of opportunities for trade, right? Also, as markets opened up, we've gained access to better nutrients, plant protection. So farmers were able to buy better seeds, to better quality seeds or fertilizer or chemical protection, whatever, plant protection, whatever. We've seen companies like Bayer, at that time Monsanto, Syngenta, entered the market. That helped us increase the yields, the productivity, right? We've seen an increase in foreign direct investments in agriculture. So a lot of money kind of flew into the agriculture because of the anticipated increase in production and exports. So that helped create quite a bit of production in ag. In 2020, we opened up the land market finally for sale. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, all the land individuals prior to the collapse, the land was owned by the government. And then once the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened is the individuals got very small pieces of land based on, you know, how much time they spent, they worked in the collective farms. And so for over 20 years, they could not open up the market because there was no pricing mechanism. People never traded land in this country. And so that's why you could own land, you could rent it, but you could not sell it until March 2020. So in March 2020, we opened up the market. So now individuals can buy the land and so they can accumulate. And so we expect more consolidation happening, which will help with the efficiency in the sector. And so, and also continued investments in transport infrastructure. Our infrastructure is well developed, but it's outdated, right? But recently we've seen a significant increase in investments in ports and in motorways in our roads. So that's something that we believe have been helping with the exports, production and exports. Still unresolved issues would be ag policy. We don't have well-established and efficient, well-working crop insurance or some safety net programs, and credit markets, because people could not sell land, they didn't really have collateral, and so there was no really established credit market for individual farmers. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of why we were able to grow the production, agricultural production, so rapidly in the last couple of years, the last actually 2 decades. So if you look at these 3 commodities, sunflower, corn, and wheat, where those exports, Ukrainian exports of those commodities go to. So who buys the majority of our exports? If you look at sunflower, it's Asia. India and China buy about half of everything, of all the exports that from Ukraine. And then we send some to Europe, Netherlands, some to Spain and Iraq. So those are the top 5 buyers of sunflower exports from Ukraine. When it comes to corn, China buys about 1/3 of all the exports from Ukraine, followed by Netherlands, and then Egypt buys some, Egypt and Spain about 10%, and some from Turkey. If we look at wheat, a lot of Ukrainian wheat goes to Egypt, about 30% of all Ukrainian exports. And then the other next large market, Indonesia and Pakistan, so Southeast Asia and Middle East, Bangladesh, and Lebanon, right? So those would be where our majority of Ukrainian ag exports go to. So if Ukraine is not able to service those markets and they go somewhere else, that will become, and say war lasts for a year or so, then Ukraine would have to reestablish those relationships again. But so then the question becomes how reliant these buyers are on Ukraine, right? Because they buy, I mean, they export it not just from Ukraine, they export it from other countries as well. So if you look at China, if you look at corn market, China buys about half of the corn, the exports from Ukraine. Half of their purchases come from Ukraine, and about 44% from US. So China and Netherlands are pretty reliant on the corn production, corn exports, followed by about a third of all purchases, corn purchases for Egypt and Spain come from Ukraine as well. So again, these five countries indeed are reliant on Ukraine, but again, the question would be what are the potential sources where they can turn to and redirect their purchases. When it comes to sunflower, the situation is even more drastic. So if you look at India and China, and Netherlands, over 70% of their purchases come from Ukraine, right? And then Spain and Iraq, again, even higher numbers. So all these buyers significantly rely on Ukraine. And another important aspect is if you look at India and China, the other country where they source their sunflower oil and seeds from is indeed from Russia. So again, if Russia, because of the sanctions and supply chain issues right now, production difficulties, maybe if Russia is not able to export sunflower seed to those countries, then that would become an issue as well. And sunflower oil may not be as big of an issue here in Northern America, but in Middle East and Asia, that's a primary type of oil that individuals use for cooking and for consumption. So finally, when we look at reliance on imports of wheat from Ukraine, country profile changes a little bit if you look at it. And reliance is significant. So if you look at these countries that buy wheat from Ukraine, Lebanon, for example, they source about 60% of their wheat purchases from Ukraine. Pakistan is about half. Egypt, Indonesia, about 1/3, and Bangladesh and Yemen about 20% to 23% of their purchases. And the commonality that you see in this, again, that most countries that are dependent on supplies of wheat from Ukraine would be Middle East and South Asia, Middle East, and North African countries. And the problem with that is if you look at poverty rates in the world, right? A lot of extreme poverty rates are concentrated in South Asia without the India being included in that part. But if you look at population in South Asia about 26, their poverty rates are about 26%, right? And then developing world overall about 21%. So a lot of these countries would fall into that list. So these are the countries that are already struggling with food security, and that's on top of the tight supplies and higher prices that they will have to deal. So again, these are just a reminder. These are the countries that Ukraine sells a lot of their exports to, sends a lot of their exports to. I also wanted to share with you a list of countries that are heavily dependent on Ukraine and Russia for the purchases of wheat, but we don't necessarily sell as much of our exports to them in terms of volume wise, right? So we may sell maybe 1% of our exports to Somalia, but to Somalia, that's about 80% of their of all the wheat that they purchase worldwide, right? So if you see the yellow bar shows, the yellow color shows them purchases of wheat from Ukraine and the blue from Russia. And here you can see the list of countries that are so heavily dependent on, again, particularly Russia, but also significantly on Ukraine, like Somalia, Laos, Egypt, Sudan, Senegal. Again, the common denominator is then all these North African, Sub-Saharan, and Middle Eastern countries are already struggling with their poverty rates, and so this is going to be another difficulty they'll have to overcome to either find other sources or markets or find an alternative. And so another piece of information I wanted to share with you. So what's the current situation on the ground? Currently, Ukraine has plenty of grain stocks. So we've calculated that they have about 2 years worth of grain consumption if we had domestically. So that's one kind of point. The other point is we do have grain set aside for export. We have about, as of now, we have about 234 million bushels of wheat and about 585 million bushels of corn that's available as of now for export. And so these would be the months when they would be exporting these, sending exports actively to all these countries. But again, typically we would send about 1.5 billion worth of exports in a month, ag exports in a month during this period, right? And that's about 195 million bushels of grains per month. But guess what? In March, we, instead of sending 195 million bushels, we sent only 19.5 million exported in March. So we've lost pretty much 90% of that 1.5 billion of ag exports in March. And so why? Because again of the war, because export routes have been choked and we could not export move those exports. As of planting, in terms of planting began, and for corn and sunflower, we do it in April and May, and then for wheat, September, October for winter wheat. So the planting started. Farmers are hoping to get at least between 60 and 80% of the crop projected crop in the ground, and so they remain positive. There's a lot of collaboration that goes in the government right now to help them move with logistics, to help with to kind of expedite the routes for seed and fertilizer supplies, etc. And then another on the export side, again, a lot of attention in the war now switched from the north to the southern part of Ukraine. And the southern part of Ukraine, this is where we have access to the Black Sea. This is where the ports are located. And so we are actively looking for alternative logistic routes. And so the plan as of now that they already started implementing, and it seems like it's working. Again, it's not as efficient, but they use rail transport to put grain on the train and move it down along the southern coast down to Romania and a couple other countries, neighboring countries, and then particularly use the seaports in Romania to export it. So that's kind of the solution that they have as of now. And again, there have been a couple of export projects that's been export contracts that they were able to execute in this in the month of March. But again, the questions remain: will we harvest winter wheat? This July. Will Ukraine be able to plant corn and wheat, and will they be able to plant the following winter wheat in September? So CoBank, just one quick note, CoBank did a study where they've kind of made a lot of assumptions, because you have to, because we don't know what's going to happen with this situation. But they assumed, okay, let's look at the wheat market. If Ukraine is able to harvest only 50% of wheat that we planted last year, this July, right? If we're able to get only 50% of that crop, if we are able to plant only 75% of the crop in 2022, 2023, and if globally production of wheat increases by about 1%, and assuming that the export routes will remain kind of choked, will be functioning, but at very low capacity, what will happen? And so they've looked at two kind of indicators in the market. They looked at stock to use ratio, and then they looked at the price. And so they've projected, again, based on very kind of limited set of assumptions, they projected the stock to use will drop from 15 to about 10% in this upcoming year, and price will go up to 10, about almost $11. But again, in their analysis, you may think that the price looks pretty low. In their analysis, they've assumed that Russia will still be able to sell wheat without major disruptions, and I think that's what holds that price lower. If there are some issues with Russia, then that Russian production and exports, that price would be impacted significantly. So who can really help us ease this global shortage in ag commodities? Well, Ukraine feeds about 400 million people globally, right? So it is a big issue for food security. And as we looked at those profile of those countries that are buying wheat, particularly wheat from Ukraine, those are vulnerable markets already: Middle East, North Africa. So how can who else can fill in the gap? When it comes to wheat, India and Australia, those are the two countries we're looking at right now to help out with wheat. India, as of now, holds about 3 times the volume of that they need of wheat annually, right? So they have 3 times of what they actually need. So there's large stocks that they have, where the expectation or the hope is that they will be able to export some of that. Typically, their wheat is not really competitive in export market, so they consume it domestically. But in this case, that's an opportunity for them to do that. And Australia can pick up some acres. For corn, of course, it will be US, Brazil, and Argentina. But again, another issue is fertilizer, right? Russia and Belarus are largest producers of fertilizer. And the uncertainty remains how producers will respond to changes in the fertilizer availability and prices, and then how that affects their planting decision between corn and soybeans. But those are the 3 countries that potentially could help out with the corn gap. And then sunflower seed and oil would be Argentina and Romania. So the final thoughts, the war in Ukraine will definitely impact global markets, at least we think for the next 2 years, if not more. It really depends on a lot of things that are outside of our control, right? And so that's why predicting anything, regardless of how good of a modeler you are or economist, predicting the outcome is very difficult in this case, because you simply don't know how long the war will last. But we believe that the impact on the global food security will depend on the ability and the willingness of these countries, like I mentioned in the previous slide, to come in and fill in those gaps that we have in those three commodities at least. So grain prices will definitely remain elevated, but they will also remain volatile. And then the final point is that I wanted to make is that, personally, it's been a really heavy topic. It's been heavy on my heart for a lot of personal reasons, but my heart also hurts with people who started their farming operations, who put their, started building their careers there, their livelihoods, and now they see infrastructure being destroyed and kind of jeopardizing everything they've built so far. But that made me pretty, to be honest, pretty pessimistic. But what made me optimistic recently, I think, after reflecting on it, is the unity that Ukrainians set aside any differences in backgrounds, political views, anything, and they are united, they stay united. And I think that that's what's really going to make a difference. And then another is the creativity in how they approach some of these issues. An example I'll give you, one of our celebrities decided to fundraise $300,000 to find raise $300,000 to buy a drone from, I believe, Turkey. And so they opened it up to the general public, and people doubted. They were like, how long is it going to take to collect that money? And what I was amazed with is that they gave people options to donate in our currency, Ukrainian currency called hryvnia, in dollars, in euros, in gold, and in crypto. So for me personally, hearing that people are not limiting themselves in how they approach and solve these issues, I think that creativity, that now you can donate and they are willing to accept and make it work with even gold and crypto. So to me, the creativity in problem solving is what I believe is going to also affect, and that the outcome, and that gives me optimism. That makes me a little more optimistic. So again, my heart is heavy, but I remain hopeful. Thank you, guys. That's all I had. I'm more than welcome, and will be more than excited to answer any of the questions or clarifications that you guys have.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, Iuliia. We're going to open it up to questions. If you want to put it in the chat or the questions box. I know you spoke to me about your family and friends. Can you talk to me a little bit, maybe, I guess, to start off the questions on how do they feel safe right now? Like, how are their emotions?
I think during the war, your reality changes, right? And your perception of your perception of what's safe changes. They believe that they are safe because they are located in the middle, kind of right in the middle of the country, so the central part. They have airstrike alerts every day, but because, again, they don't send as many rockets or missiles, our detection system is able to detect and shoot them down, right? So they don't really have active shelling, but they have a lot of alerts. And so every time they have an alert, regardless if you're at work or if you're at home, you do what? You grab your bag and you go to the basement. So they feel like it's safe, relatively safe, because they have not been hit. And they compare, for them, safety now is not being hit. But again, my perception of safety, we go out, we don't have to worry about alerts. And they're only 2 hours south of Kyiv, so of the capital. So again, as of now, they believe they are safe, but they know that it can change very quickly, especially with the way this non-traditional war is happening. But yeah, that's the first thing. I don't know if you saw it on Facebook, all the memes about Ukraine, but the first thing you do now as a Ukrainian living abroad, you text your family when you wake up, and then you check if President Zelensky is alive and well. So those are the two things I do, unfortunately, before I even have a cup of coffee. So that's the new reality.